Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all of you tuning in from all around the world. My name is Luke, and welcome to an exciting How to Academy livestream. For those of you watching for the first time, the How to Academy is a home for people who think big. Whether you're interested in political analysis or self-help, growing your business, or exploring the legacy of hip-hop, you are all more than welcome here. We host live streams virtually every day, so please check out our website for more information. Now, we are very lucky tonight to have with us Professor David Sumpter of the University of Uppsala. David is the author of the incredibly influential Soccermatics and Outnumbered, which have been translated into 10 languages, as well as Collective Animal Behaviour, the leading text in an academic field he helped create. He has consulted in sports betting and worked in the world's biggest clubs and national teams, including Hammarby, Barcelona and England. His new book, The 10 Equations That Rule the World, is out now. In this talk, David is going to be discussing the power and influence of formulas in our lives, about whether they can help us choose a new Netflix show, get out of a bad relationship, or if they can help us see the world in an entirely new way. David is going to talk for about 40 minutes, followed by an audience Q&A section, which is your chance to ask some questions. So please write any that you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor David Sumpter. David, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that really lovely introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. It always feels interesting this time. Last time I did one of these talks, I was in my office. This time I decided, well, it's Friday night, I should be at home. So I'm sitting in my wife's study. So if you see there's any books you're interested in, don't ask me about them, please, because they're my wife's. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about 10 different equations. And in a way, this is also a sort of glimpse into my life, because I sat down before I wrote this book and I thought about what are the most important equations in the world. And I also thought about, well, how can we use them? So the title of my talk, I'll share my screen, is How Learning These 10 Equations Can Improve Your Life. Of course, I'm not going to go through all 10 equations this evening. I'm going to go in detail into one or two of them and tell you a little bit about some of the others. But I'm going to start with this picture. This was a little research I did before I wrote the book, and I found there are just an incredible number of self-help books out there. There's Marie Kondo and her Tidying Up, life-changing magic of tidying up. There's Rising Strong. There's Jordan Peterson, who has his 12 rules for life. There's Leaning In. There's Decluttering Your Mind, Learning Like Einstein. I like this. There's actually the 7. I've put the 7 laws of confidence there, but I found the 7, 10, or 12 laws for confidence. And then I love this one here: 16 laws for confidence. So I'm afraid I haven't read that one, but that's how many little laws there are for gangster confidence. So here's the question: if there's all of these books with all of this different advice, it can't be simple, right? Because otherwise there would just be one book, we'd write it all down, and then we'd go home and we'd be happy. And what mathematicians like is answers of that form. They don't like loads of different rules and lots of complicated ideas. What they like is simple equations which you can follow and understand and make your life a better place. And that is the challenge that I took up. Could mathematics hold the answer we're all looking for? Could we use it to find the answer to all the problems in our lives, and even to some degree the meaning of life itself? And that's a challenge. I'm not going to claim that I completely solved all of these problems, but I made a very good attempt of trying to find out both how 10 equations, which some people know, a small proportion of the population, rule the world. They're used in a wide range of different settings by social media companies, by finance, in gambling, in football. These small number of equations are really key to all of those different areas. And also, going back to the self-help idea, well, how can I tell you how you can use these equations as well? So that's what we're going to try and do. We're going to start with, as I said, I'm going to go into detail of a couple of the equations today. And I'm going to start with what I call the Judgement Equation. Okay, so to think about the Judgement Equation, I want you to imagine the following scenario. Imagine you're an experienced traveler, having flown 100 times before, but the flight you are now on is different. As you descend, the plane starts to rattle and shake in a way that you've never experienced before. The woman next to you lets out a gasp. The man sitting across the aisle grips his knees. Everyone around you is visibly scared. Could this be it? Could the worst possible scenario be about to unfurl? Of course, I didn't know when I wrote the book that we would be grounded for about a year and nobody would be flying. But I think many of you will be able to remember this feeling that it is scary when the plane begins to shake. And you do start to wonder, okay, we know that flying is safe overall, but could this be it? We're in a scary situation. Right, so what do we do? Well, we want to know, now we're going to use a bit of mathematical formalism. We want to know the probability that we are going to crash given all the shaking. And this is how we write this as an equation. So P means probability, crash means crash, and shake means shake. And so this little line here means given. So the probability of a crash given shaking. So that's what we want to work out, but we don't know that quite yet. How will we work that out? Well, I'll start here. Start by thinking about the 100 flights that you've been on. That's all of the 100 flights in a 10 by 10 box. And this is the one that you're on now. This is the shakiest, scariest flight that you've ever been on. And what we can tell from this is, well, if we don't crash, and let's assume for argument's sake that we don't crash, then the probability of all of this shaking, given that we're not going to crash, is about 1 in 100, because you've been on 100 flights before with less shaking, and the probability you get this much shaking is 1 in 100. So we've got that piece of information. That's not what we wanted to know. We wanted to know P crash given shake. Okay, so a bit more work. Next thing, I just want to get this point about the shaking across to you here, that think about this. If you went on 2,000 airplane journeys, not very good for the climate. Most people haven't been on that many journeys, but if you did, you would experience about 20 shaking events that were as bad as this. Now, imagine if you went on 10 million airplane journeys. Now, you're not going to do that in your lifetime, obviously. But the rate of crashes of airplanes is very small. In fact, it's 1 in 10 million plane journeys end in a crash. So that's pretty reassuring to us. And this matrix, this arrangement of all the airplane journeys and all the shaking journeys, this gives us some idea of what that 10 million looks like. 10 million is 10,000 journeys on this columns, multiplied by 1,000 journeys on the column. It's a very big number. But hidden in there, there is, unfortunately, one very unfortunate crash. And this matrix tells us, well, the probability of a crash, that's without thinking about if it's shaking or not, is 1 in 10 million. And if you do crash, then it's kind of obvious that there is going to be lots of shaking before you crash. So the probability probability of shaking, given there's a crash, well, that's 1. It's 100%. So now we've got 3 pieces of information. Now, what I want to emphasize here, and before I do the calculation, we can already see where this is leading, because inside this 10 million journeys, I've got 10,000 shaky journeys. So that's 10 million divided by 100. Sorry, I've got 100,000 shaky journeys, which is 10 million divided by 100. And I've just got 1 crash journey. And now this gives us what we want. The probability your shaky journey is the crash journey is approximately 1 in 100,000. So it felt dangerous in the first instance. It was the worst thing you'd ever experienced on an airplane, but there was still only a 1 in 100,000 chance that you were on that horrible crash journey. There was, I think, a 99.999% chance that you were just on the worst journey of your life and you didn't need to worry. So P crash given shake is equal to 1 divided by 100,000. Now, what I've done here is I've given what mathematicians call a frequentist argument for this. So I've looked at the frequency of different things and used that to work out the probability of crashing. We can also, and this is what I call the judgment equation, we can take all of the information we have and we can put it in what's called the judgment equation. Now, the judgment equation takes in P crash, P shake given crash, P shake given not crash, and it works out P crash given shake. And it works it out as follows. I'm going to come back to this equation a few times. So I just want to give you a feeling for it to start with, but we're going to look at it 4 times. So you'll hopefully get a clearer and clearer idea as it goes on. But the idea is we multiply here the P shake given crash by P crash, and we divide it by that thing itself, plus something to do with what happens when it's not crashed. So I'll come back to how this works later on, but that calculation gives 1 in 100,000 as well. And this thing is what we're going to call the judgment equation. Now, this can be used in a wide range of different applications. It's actually its real name is Bayes' rule, and it originated from the late 18th century, was when it was first written down by the Reverend Thomas Bayes. And he was interested in a variety of different problems, but it's now used in a wide range of things. And what you'll have heard about it most in is the Corona crisis, because it's also used for thinking about false positives. So if you've got, so a lot of the debate about, I think now there's a big outbreak again. So people who are tested, they have actually got the disease. But there was a period where there was a very low level of people who had corona. And then there was a question about false positives. Who has been tested for the disease? They get a positive result back, but they haven't actually get it. And that seems very confusing, because often it was said that the reliability of the test was 99.9%, for example. Now, what I've illustrated here is, imagine we've got a test, it's not 99.9% reliable, but imagine we've got a test which is 99% reliable. And in this array of this 10 by 10 array, we've only got one person who has just got a test result back and has been tested positive. Now, we actually know that that person isn't positive. They're the person who we've made a mistake on, because we took 100 people who didn't have the disease, and we made the mistake on. Now, also imagine if 1 in 100 people in the population actually have the disease. And that's what I show on this matrix over here. So now I've got 100 people, and one of them is the actual person with the disease. So when people go to get tested, you can either be in this situation where you're the one unlucky person who got the wrong test, or you can be this situation where you're the one even unluckier person who's actually infected with the disease. And this means that overall, when you get tested, there's a 50-50 chance that you're that person who got the wrong result, or you're that person who's actually got the disease. And that's why there is a high that you need to worry about. Even though you've got a low false positive rate, you're only making a mistake 1 time in 100, you can still, if you're the person who's taking the test, you can still be the person, it's still quite likely in certain situations that you'll get the wrong test result back. Now, this is very complicated, and it gets, or that bit's simple, I think. That's straightforward, why you might have not been infected. But what becomes difficult is who tests themselves. Now, if you don't have any symptoms, if I go back to these people, they didn't have any symptoms, they just went for the test. And what actually happens in reality is it's people with symptoms who go for the test. And in that case, if I show you this picture, if you look very carefully, you'll see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people who have got symptoms, and there's one person who's got the disease. And so if only the people with symptoms go and get tested, then it becomes much less likely that you get these false positives. And that's very difficult for us to know the proportion of people with symptoms and with not symptoms who are actually going to get tested. So there isn't an easy answer to this, but we always have to be aware of that possibility for false positives. So I'll move on from that because I wrote the 10 equations before the Corona crisis, and it was delayed coming out because of it. But what I really wanted to get across is this sort of view that I have of the world. And it might be, I've always had this view, or it might be specifically because I'm an applied mathematician. But my view of the world is often as a model, as a film of the future. So I sort of think about, if I'm on a plane and I'm in this sort of shaky conditions, I start to think about these horrible things that can happen to me. And I start to worry about them, of course. But what I see, what I see is a sort of film of this horrible scenario. And what that's called in mathematics is a model. A model is a thing like a plane crash. I also, if I swim in the sea where I know there's sharks, then I get scared of a shark attack. When I'm thinking about getting a new job, I imagine my model is, I imagine I might get a new job. And I've just said the example where you're infected with the disease is a model you have. I've had that model in my head repeatedly. I don't think I've had corona actually, but I've had this repeated model in my head that I've got it and I'm beginning to feel a bit ill and so on. And so I have that model in my head quite often. And then you should separate that from data. So models can be right and they can be wrong, but data tends to be information that's correct. Unless you've made some sort of misreading, data is something which is correct. So data is maybe shaking. If I'm thinking about a shark attack, it's movement in the water. It's the interview that I've gone through, how that went. It's the medical tests that I've just completed. So I separate those things. I separate my concerns into a model and the data, which then informs my model. And the judgment equation is one example, one very clear example where we can make this clear separation into model and data. And the way we do it is this, that M is the model and D is the data. So if you remember, M is the crash and D was the shaking of the plane. And we always want to work out the probability our model is true given the data. And that comes from the equation that we have. The probability of the data given the model is true. So what we calculate here, this was, yeah, I just want to put this up one more time, then I'm going to explain where it all comes from in the next example. But this is the probability of the data given the model is true multiplied by our estimate of the model beforehand. I'll maybe try and give a little bit more insight into this. So this was our 1 in 10 million before we had any data. That was our kind of base rate of crashing. And then this was the data, this was the we got when we actually felt the plane was shaking. Those things multiplied together, divided by themselves, plus the alternative model that there was no crash going to occur, there was no shaking, there was no crash going to occur given the shaking, gives us this overall probability of the model given the data.